My name is Ruth Ann Yoder, and I am 71 years old. Before I tell you what happened on the day they carried my father's farm to auction, I want you to do something for me. If you have ever lost someone you loved, if you have ever stood on land that meant more to you than your own life, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel, because there will be more stories like this one. And I would love it so much if you would leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. I have never left my county in Pennsylvania in my whole life, but I like to think of all of you out there, in your kitchens and your cars and your porches, listening to an old woman tell you about her father's land. Now let me tell you the story, because it is not one I tell often, and it is not one I will ever forget. I was born in the spring of 1955, in a farmhouse with no electric lines running to it, on 340 acres of Lancaster County ground that my great-grandfather had cleared with a team of mules and his own 2 hands. My father, Amos Stoltzfus, was born in that same house, in the same upstairs bedroom, 26 years before me. And when I was born, they laid me in a cradle that my father himself had built from the walnut trees that grew along the fence line. The same fence line where the cows used to press their big warm noses through the wire, looking for someone to scratch behind their ears. I want you to understand something about my father before I tell you the rest, because you cannot understand what happened at that auction unless you understand what kind of man he was. Amos Stoltzfus was not a loud man. He did not raise his voice, not at his mules, not at his children, not even the time my brother Eli let the gate open and half the herd wandered onto the county road. He simply walked out into that road in his bare feet at 5 in the morning and brought every last cow home, one by one, speaking low to them the whole time like they were old friends who had simply wandered off to visit a neighbor. He farmed the way his father farmed, and the way his father's father farmed before that. No tractors, no electric lights in the barn, horses to pull the plow, and his own 2 hands and his own 2 boys, when the boys were old enough, to do the rest. We raised corn and hay and tobacco in the early years, though later he gave up the tobacco because he said it did not sit right with him to grow a crop that could not feed a hungry family. We kept dairy cows, 40 of them at the most, because he said any more than that, and a man stops knowing his animals by name. And a man ought to know his animals by name. I was the 5th of 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls, and I was the one who stayed closest to home my whole life. My older sisters married and moved to farms of their own, some as far as Ohio, one all the way to a settlement in Kentucky I have still never seen with my own eyes. My brothers took up their own ground when they came of age, all except for Eli, who felt the call to preach and gave up farming altogether for a life of tending souls instead of soil. But me, I stayed. I married a good man named John Ann Yoder. We called him John Ann because there were 3 other John Yoders in our church district, and a body has to be told apart somehow. And John Ann and I built our own small house just up the lane from my father's place, close enough that I could walk to my mother's kitchen table most mornings before the dew burned off the grass. My mother passed when I was 42 years old. Cancer took her slow over the better part of 2 years, and I nursed her myself in that same upstairs bedroom where my father had been born, and where I had been born, and where, eventually, my mother breathed her last with my father holding one of her hands and me holding the other. After she was gone, my father did not remarry, though there were women in our church district, widows themselves, who would have been glad to sit across the supper table from him for the rest of his days. He said there was only one Mary Stoltzfus in this world, and he had already been given the gift of 41 years with her, and that was enough gift for one man's lifetime. So my father farmed alone after that, though of course he was never truly alone, not in an Amish community, not with sons and sons-in-law and grandsons close enough to help with the heavy seasons. Not with me just up the lane checking on him every single day of his life for the next 19 years. He grew old the way an oak tree grows old. Slow and solid, bent a little more each year by the wind, but never once considering falling down. Even at 83 years of age, he was still out in that barn before sunrise, still milking alongside his grandsons, still walking his own fence lines in the evening with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at his corn the way another man might look at a sunset. I need to tell you about the land itself now, because the land was not just dirt and fence posts to my father. It was a covenant. His grandfather had come to that ground back when it was still half wild, when there were tree stumps in what would become the North Pasture, and the creek still ran wherever it pleased instead of where the drainage tile told it to run. 3 generations of Stoltzfus hands had turned that ground over, had pulled rocks out of it by the wagon load, had bled into it, quite literally, my own great-uncle having lost 2 fingers to a hay rake when he was a young man. My father used to say that ground does not belong to a man. A man belongs to the ground, for as long as God sees fit to lend him breath, and then the ground passes to the next set of hands, and the story keeps going. I tell you all this so that you will understand why, when my father died, the question of what would happen to that farm was not a small question. It was not simply a matter of property and money, though as you will hear, money became a very large part of this story, whether any of us wanted it to or not. It was a question of whether 3 generations of prayer and sweat and sacrifice would keep going, or whether it would end, right there, with an auctioneer's gavel coming down on a Saturday morning in October. My father died on a Tuesday in late August, 4 years ago now, though it feels like both yesterday and 100 years ago. The way grief plays tricks with time. He had been slowing down that whole summer, though none of us wanted to say the word that was sitting right there in the room with us every time we visited. He was 87 years old. His heart, the doctors told us later, had simply been tired for a long while. Tired the way a man is tired after a long day's threshing. Except this tiredness did not lift with a night's sleep. He had gone out to the barn that morning, same as every morning of his life, and my nephew Amos, named for his grandfather, found him sitting on the milking stool, leaned up against the flank of old Bessie, the gentlest cow in the herd, like he had simply sat down to rest a moment, and his heart had decided, quietly, and without any fuss at all, that it was time to stop. There was no pain on his face, my nephew told us, only a kind of peace, like a man who had finished his work and was satisfied with it. I will not spend a great deal of this story on the grief itself, because grief is grief, and I think you have likely known your own, and you do not need an old woman describing hers in great detail to understand the shape of it. I will only say that when they came up the lane to tell me, I was standing in my own kitchen with flour on my hands, making bread the way I had made bread every Tuesday for 40 years, and I remember thinking, in the strange way the mind wanders in shock, that I would need to remember to take the bread out of the oven, because my father would not want good bread to burn, not even on the day he left this world. We buried him the way we bury all our dead, plain and quick, and surrounded entirely by community. There was no embalming parlor with strange perfumed air, no casket lined in satin. My brothers and my husband built the coffin themselves, out of pine, plain as the day is long, the way my father would have wanted it. Women I had known my whole life came to sit with the body, in shifts through the 2 days before the burial, so that he was never once left alone, the same way he had never once left any of us alone, in our own hard hours. Nearly 300 people came to the funeral, from our own church district and from districts 2 counties over, because my father had touched more lives in his 87 years than even I had known. We buried him on a hillside in the plain cemetery where his own mother and father lay, where my mother had been resting for 19 years already, waiting, I like to think, for him to finally come along and lie down beside her again. And when it was done, when the last shovelful of earth had been placed, and the last hymn had been sung, low and slow, and without any instrument at all, the way we sing our hymns, I stood there and I looked down the hill at the farm in the distance, the white house and the red barn, and the fields going gold at the edges with the first hint of autumn, and I thought, foolishly perhaps, that the hardest part was now behind me. I want you to know that this is not a story about greedy children fighting over an inheritance. I have heard those stories, and they break my heart. Families torn apart by money over a parent's grave before the ground has even settled. That is not what happened in my family, and I want to be very clear about that, because what did happen is complicated enough without you thinking ill of my brothers and sisters. We all loved that land. We all wanted, more than anything, for it to stay in the family. The trouble was never about wanting. The trouble was about what was possible. My father, you see, though he had lived a long life of hard work and careful frugality, had also lived through some very lean years in his later decades that none of us fully understood until after he was gone. There had been a bad run of years in the 80s when milk prices fell through the floor and stayed there for the better part of a decade. There had been medical bills from my mother's long illness that our community's mutual aid had covered a great deal of, but not all of. Because that is not always how it works even among us, especially not for the newer treatments the doctors kept recommending in her final year. There had been a barn fire in 1991 that took half the herd and most of the equipment, and though the community had done a barn raising within that same season, the cost of restocking cattle and buying new equipment had put my father into debt with the bank in a way he had never been in debt before in his entire life. He had been paying that debt down slowly, quietly, for over 20 years, the way he did everything, never once complaining, never once letting on to us children how tight the money truly was. It was only after he died, when my brother Eli, who had some head for numbers, sat down with the bank papers and the farm's records, that we understood the truth. There was still a debt on that land, a debt large enough that it could not simply be absorbed by the family the way we absorb most things, through shared labor and quiet generosity. The bank was patient with us at first. Banks in our part of the country understand Amish farms, understand that we are good for our debts even if we pay them slow. Because in 100 and some years, an Amish farmer defaulting on a loan is about as rare a thing as you will find. But my father's estate, according to the law of the state of Pennsylvania, according to rules none of us had any say in writing, had to be settled. And settling an estate with debt against it, when none of the 8 children had the ready cash to pay that debt off outright, meant one thing, and one thing only. The farm would have to be sold at auction. I remember the evening we all sat around my father's kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten 10,000 meals as a child, and my brother Eli explained the numbers to us in his slow, careful preacher's voice. I remember looking around that table at my brothers' faces, weathered by decades of sun and work, and my sisters' faces, some of them lined with a grief that matched my own, and I remember the silence that fell over that room. a silence so heavy you could nearly hear the corn growing in the fields outside. It was my brother Amos, the oldest of us, who finally spoke. He said that if the farm had to be sold, then it had to be sold, and we would trust that God had a plan in it, even if none of us could see the plan yet. That is how we are raised, you understand. We do not fight against what cannot be changed. We bend, the way a green branch bends in a storm instead of snapping. But I will tell you honestly, sitting at that table, I did not feel bent so much as I felt broken, though I did not say so out loud, because that is not the Amish way either, to put your own private grief above the peace of the family. I want to explain something here for those of you watching who are not familiar with how an estate settles among Amish families, because it is different from how the English world does things, and it matters for understanding what happened next. When land must be sold, it is sold at public auction, and by Pennsylvania law, that auction is open to anyone who wishes to bid, Amish or English, neighbor or stranger, farmer or land developer. My father's farm, sitting as it did along a county road that had, in recent years, begun attracting the attention of builders looking to put up what they call estate homes for wealthy people who want a country view without any actual farming attached to it, was, I came to understand, a very desirable piece of ground to certain kinds of buyers. This is the part of the story that kept me awake at night for the 2 months between my father's death and the day the auction notice went up in the local paper. I did not fear losing the farm to one of my own brothers, or to a neighbor down the road who might farm it well and keep the fields growing corn instead of houses. I feared losing it to a stranger from outside our world entirely. Someone who saw 340 acres of prime Lancaster County soil, not as a covenant passed down through generations, not as the resting place of my father's sweat and my grandfather's bones, but as a number on a spreadsheet, a development opportunity. 40 half-acre lots with a cul-de-sac where the north pasture used to be. Before I go further, let me tell you a little more about what those 2 months between my father's funeral and the auction actually looked like from the inside, because I think it matters for understanding just how dark that valley truly was before the light broke through it. Grief, in our community, does not excuse a person from their chores. The cows still needed milking morning and evening, whether my heart was breaking or not. The garden still needed to be put to bed for the winter. The canning still needed finishing. My own grandchildren still needed their supper on the table at 5:30. So I moved through those weeks in a kind of fog, doing all the things a body does, while underneath it all a second, quieter grief was building. The grief of the coming auction, and I found that the physical work was almost a mercy, because it gave my hands something to do, while my mind turned over numbers it could not solve. I remember one evening in particular, perhaps 3 weeks after the funeral, when my daughter Sarah came to sit with me, after her own children were down for the night. She was 26 then, married just 2 years, and she found me at my kitchen table with a pencil and a scrap of paper, trying, foolishly, to work out some arrangement by which John Ann and I might scrape together enough to make a serious bid ourselves. I had turned figures around in my head so many times that they had all begun to blur together, and when Sarah sat down across from me and saw what I was doing, she did not laugh at me, though she might have had every right to, given how far short those numbers fell from anything close to what the land would actually bring. She simply put her hand over mine on the table and said, "Mem, some things are not ours to carry alone." I did not understand what she meant by that. Not fully. Not yet. Though I think now, looking back, that perhaps she had already heard some small whisper of what the community was quietly arranging. Some rumor passed along through her husband's family, though she never once let on to me. keeping the secret as faithfully as everyone else did. I also want to tell you about a conversation I had with my father's old friend and neighbor, a man named Reuben Fisher, who had farmed the property adjoining ours for over 50 years and had known my father since they were boys together in the one-room schoolhouse 2 miles down the road. Reuben came to visit me about a month before the auction, ostensibly to return a hay rake my father had lent him the previous spring, though I have come to believe now that the hay rake was simply an excuse, a reason to knock on my door and look me in the eye and see how I was truly holding up. We sat on my porch that afternoon, and he told me stories about my father as a young man, stories I had never heard before, about the two of them sneaking off to go fishing when they were supposed to be shocking wheat, about a prank they had played on their schoolteacher involving a garter snake and an unlocked desk drawer. He made me laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in weeks, and before he left, he took my hand in both of his weathered old hands and said, "Ruth Ann, your father was the best friend a man could ask for in this life, and I do not believe for one moment that God is finished taking care of his family yet." I thanked him, politely, the way you do. Though privately, I confess I did not fully believe him. I did not know, of course, that Reuben Fisher himself had already pledged a portion of his own savings to the trust that Bishop Byler was quietly assembling. Nor did I know that he had spent that very afternoon, before ever knocking on my door, visiting 3 other families down the road to ask for their help as well. I did not have the money to buy the farm myself. I want to be honest with you about that, because false modesty has no place in a true story. My husband John Ann and I had our own small dairy operation, 60 acres that had come to us through his own family, and we were comfortable in the plain way that Amish families are comfortable, which is to say we never went hungry, and we never went into debt beyond what a season's crop could cover. But we did not have anywhere near the sum of money that 340 acres of prime farmland would fetch at auction, not with English land developers likely to be bidding against us. None of my brothers had that kind of money sitting free either. Amos had his own farm and 3 sons to help him work it, but every dollar he had was tied up in his own operation. Eli, having given his life to preaching, had never accumulated much wealth at all, nor had he ever wanted to. My younger brothers, Daniel and Levi, were still building up their own young farms and families, still paying off their own land, and could not have put together enough cash to compete with a developer, even if they had pooled every dollar between them. So you can understand, I hope, the particular kind of grief I carried in those 2 months. It was not only the grief of losing my father, though that grief was plenty heavy on its own. It was the grief of watching a slow disaster approach, the way you might watch a storm building on the horizon for hours before it finally reaches you, knowing exactly what is coming and being powerless to stop it. I would walk the fence lines of that farm in the evenings after my own chores were done, and I would run my hand along the wood my father's hands had built and mended 1,000 times over, and I would think, this will all be gone soon. Strangers will stand where I am standing. They will not know that this is where my father taught me to milk a cow when I was 6 years old, my small hands wrapped around his big ones. They will not know that this fence post right here is the one my brother Daniel drove his buggy horse into as a teenager, and how my father laughed so hard about it that he could not even properly scold him. I did not share the full weight of this fear with my children or my husband, not because I did not trust them, but because that is simply how I was raised, to carry your own private sorrows quietly, so as not to burden others who have sorrows enough of their own. But I think John Ann knew anyway, the way a husband of 40 some years comes to know his wife's heart even when she says nothing at all. He would find me standing at the kitchen window some evenings, looking down the lane toward my father's place, and he would come stand beside me without a word. And just that, just his presence beside me at the window, was enough of a comfort to get me through to the next day. The auction notice went up in early October, about 6 weeks after my father's passing, once the estate had gone through the necessary legal steps. I remember the day my brother Eli brought the paper up to my house, folded to the page with the notice on it, and set it on my kitchen table without a word. The way you might set down something heavy you did not want to be holding anymore. Public auction. Real estate and personal property. The estate of Amos K. Stoltzfus, deceased, 340 acres, more or less, improved with farmhouse, barn, and outbuildings, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to be sold at absolute auction, Saturday, October the 14th, 10 o'clock in the morning, on the premises. I read that notice perhaps a dozen times that afternoon, and each time the words felt less real, like they were describing some other farm, some other family's grief, not my own father's ground. Not the place where I had learned to walk and to pray and to love. Absolute auction. Those two words sat particularly heavy on me. It meant there was no minimum price, no reserve, nothing to protect the land from going for whatever the highest bidder was willing to pay, even if that price was, in some cosmic sense, an insult to what the land was truly worth. In the 2 weeks before the auction, word began to travel through our community and beyond it about what kind of interest the farm was drawing. My husband heard from a neighbor, who had heard from a real estate agent he knew through his lumber business, that at least one development company out of the greater Philadelphia area had sent men out to walk the property, taking measurements, talking about road access and utility lines in a way that made my stomach turn when I heard it secondhand. There was talk, too, of a wealthy family looking to build what they called a gentleman's farm, a phrase I had never heard before and did not particularly care for once I understood its meaning, which was a large fancy house on a large piece of land where no actual farming would be done at all, the fields perhaps kept as decoration, mowed like a lawn instead of planted with corn. I began to have trouble sleeping. I would lie awake beside John Ann and turn the numbers over and over in my mind, trying to find some combination that would let our family keep the farm, and never finding one. I prayed. I want you to know that. I prayed harder in those 2 weeks than I believe I had ever prayed in my life. Not for riches, because that is not a prayer God particularly honors in an Amish heart, but for peace, and for some way forward that I simply could not see with my own limited eyes. What I did not know, what none of us in the immediate family knew, was that while I was lying awake at night wringing my hands over numbers that did not add up, my community, my church district, and the districts around it had already begun quietly working on a plan of their own. I want to pause here and tell you something about how an Amish community operates that I think many of you watching may not fully understand, because it is different from how the English world thinks about neighbors and money and property. We do not have insurance companies in the way you know them. When a barn burns, as my father's barn did back in 1991, the community rebuilds it, together in a single day, with no bill sent to anyone. When a family faces medical costs too large for them to bear alone, the community holds a benefit auction, a fundraiser, and covers what needs covering. This is not charity in the way the English world sometimes thinks of charity, something given from above to someone below. It is simply how we understand what it means to be a community at all. Your neighbor's burden is, in some real and practical sense, your own burden too, because that is what it means to live according to the way of Christ, bearing one another's weights. What I did not know in those 2 anxious weeks was that a group of men from our church district, led quietly by the bishop himself, a wise and gentle man named Christian Byler, had begun meeting in the evenings after chores, going farm to farm, family to family, English business owner to English business owner in the surrounding area who had dealt honestly and kindly with our community over the years, and asking one simple question. Would you be willing to help keep the Stoltzfus farm in the family? I learned later, much later, after everything was settled, just how far that quiet asking had traveled. It had gone to every family in our own district, of course, nearly 90 households. It had gone to 2 neighboring districts as well, where families who had known my father for decades, who had stood in barn-raising lines beside him, who had borrowed his equipment and lent him theirs in turn, put in what they could, $500 here, $1,000 there, whatever a family could spare without endangering their own children's welfare. It had gone even beyond our community, to English neighbors, a hardware store owner in the nearby town, who had extended credit to my father through more than 1 lean year, and never once pressed him for it. A veterinarian who had treated our animals for free more times than anyone could count, because he said Amos Stoltzfus had once helped pull his own truck out of a snowbank at 2 in the morning and refused any payment for it. Bishop Byler, I learned, had also gone to the bank himself, the very bank holding the debt against my father's estate, and had a long conversation with the bank's president, a man who had grown up in that county and understood our ways better than most English do. Together they worked out an arrangement, something the community could present as a serious, credible, cash-backed bid at the auction. A bid large enough to compete with any development company, but a bid that would come not from any single wealthy buyer, but from perhaps 60 or 70 different families and individuals, each contributing what they were able, pooled together into a single fund held in trust. And here is the part that I did not understand until the very day of the auction itself, the part that gives this story its name. The community's plan was not for me, or for any of my brothers or sisters, to place that winning bid ourselves. The plan was for the community to bid, as a unified body, under the trust that Bishop Byler and 2 other respected men had set up, and to win the farm outright at whatever price it took. And then, once the auction was concluded and the land legally secured, to transfer that land back to the Stoltzfus family, to me and my siblings together, for the sum of $1, the smallest amount the law would allow for a legal transfer of deed. Why not simply let me or one of my brothers bid, using the community's pooled money as our own funds? This was the question I asked, later, when I finally understood what had happened, and Bishop Byler explained it to me with the kind of patient wisdom that had made him a good bishop for over 20 years. He said that if I had walked into that auction as the visible buyer, even with the community's money behind me, I would have been just one more bidder among several. And if a developer with deep pockets had seen a grieving widow's daughter standing there trying to hold her ground, they might well have simply outbid me anyway, pushing the price up past what our fund could sustain, perhaps even past what any reasonable farmland value could justify, simply because they had the resources to do it and I did not, and because grief makes a person's hand shake at exactly the moment it most needs to be steady. But an anonymous trust, backed by dozens of families and community members, and even sympathetic English business owners, bidding with a united and unwavering resolve, was a different matter entirely. Bishop Byler and the other trustees had decided among themselves, before the auction ever began, the absolute maximum they were willing and able to bid, a number well above any reasonable market value for that land, precisely so that no ordinary developer would find it worthwhile to keep bidding against them. Money speaks a certain kind of language at an auction, and the community had decided to speak that language loudly and clearly and without any hesitation, so that anyone else in that field that morning would understand very quickly that this particular piece of ground was not going to be won by anyone but them. And this, finally, brings me to the morning of the auction itself, the 14th of October, 4 years ago. A morning I will remember in every small detail for the rest of my life. It was a clear, cold morning, the kind of October morning where you can see your breath in the air, but the sun promises to warm things up by midday. I had not slept more than perhaps 2 hours the night before. I remember standing in my kitchen before dawn, dressed in my plainest dark dress, the one I usually wore for funerals, because in truth that is exactly what this felt like to me. Another funeral. The funeral of my father's legacy on this earth. John Ann held my hand as we walked down the lane together toward my father's farm, and I remember the sight that greeted us as we came around the bend in the road. There were buggies lined up along that county road for what looked like half a mile in either direction. There were cars, too, parked in the field my father had always kept for hay, real estate agents in their pressed suits, standing in little clusters with clipboards, talking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the farmhouse and making notes. I remember my stomach dropping at the sight of those clusters of English businessmen, because I recognized in their posture, in the confident way they stood with their hands in their pockets surveying the land, exactly the kind of buyer I had feared for 2 long months. The auctioneer's stand had been set up in the yard between the house and the barn, and by 10 o'clock, when the auction was set to begin, I would guess there were perhaps 400 or 500 people gathered there, Amish and English both. Some come to bid, many come simply out of respect for my father, to witness this final chapter of a farm they had known their whole lives. I stood with my brothers and sisters near the front of that crowd, and I remember Eli reaching over and taking my hand, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that I ought to have brought some money with me, some small sum, as though I might somehow bid on my own father's farm, with the modest savings John Ann and I kept for emergencies, as though that gesture alone might mean something even if it accomplished nothing. The personal property went first, as is our custom, the farm equipment and tools and household goods, and I will not spend your time describing that part in great detail, except to say that watching strangers bid on my mother's canning jars and my father's hand tools was its own particular kind of ache. Though I was glad, at least, to see many of those items go to family members and neighbors who bid specifically to keep them within the community. My father's good plow horse harness going to my nephew, my mother's quilting frame going to my own daughter, small mercies scattered through a hard morning. And then, a little past noon, the auctioneer called for everyone's attention and announced that the sale of the real estate itself was about to begin. I want to tell you honestly that in that moment, standing in the yard where I had played as a child, where my wedding had been held, where my own children had run barefoot through the grass on countless summer afternoons, I felt a kind of despair I have rarely felt before or since. I looked at those real estate agents with their clipboards, and I thought, this is it. This is the end of it. 3 generations of covenant with this ground, and it is about to be handed over to men who see it as nothing more than a line item. The bidding began low, as it always does, and climbed quickly. I heard numbers called out that made my head spin. Numbers far larger than I had ever imagined a piece of farmland could fetch, and my heart sank further with each rising figure, because I assumed, in my grief and my fear, that each of those numbers was coming from some deep-pocketed developer determined to have his prize no matter the cost. I remember specific faces from that crowd even now. 4 years later, there was a young man in a grey suit, his shoes far too polished for a farm auction, who kept glancing down at his phone between bids as though he were checking with someone else, some office far away, before raising his card again. There was an older gentleman standing near the auctioneer's stand, with a rolled-up set of what I later learned were architectural drawings tucked under his arm. Drawings, I can only assume, of the houses he intended to build on my father's cornfields. Every time that man raised his hand to bid, something in my chest tightened like a fist, and I found myself gripping John Ann's arm so hard that he later told me I had left small bruises on his forearm, though he never once complained about it. Not that day, and not since. The auctioneer's voice rolled on in that fast musical chant that auctioneers use. A kind of song I had heard my whole life at farm sales and livestock auctions, though I had never before had to listen to it while it decided the fate of my own father's life's work. Numbers climbed by 5,000, then by 10,000. The auctioneer's assistant moving through the crowd, calling out who was bidding and pointing toward each new hand that rose. I remember the murmur that ran through the onlookers, English and Amish alike, as the price climbed well past what anyone standing there had likely expected a piece of farmland, however fine, to fetch. I heard someone behind me whisper to a companion that the developers must want this ground very badly indeed to be paying such a price for it, and I remember thinking, with a kind of hollow despair, that of course they wanted it badly, because they could see, the same as I could see, exactly what that ground was worth. Not only in dollars, but in everything a person cannot put a dollar figure on. At all. It was only when the bidding climbed past a number that I knew, even in my limited understanding of land values, was already well beyond what any sensible farmer would pay, and kept climbing still, that I began to feel something shift in the air around me. A kind of tension I did not yet understand. I turned to look at where the bids were coming from, and I saw, to my astonishment, that it was not the men in suits calling out those rising numbers. It was Bishop Byler himself, standing calm and steady near the front of the crowd, raising his hand at each new figure the auctioneer called, his face showing no more emotion than if he were bidding on a bushel of apples at a county fair. I did not understand, in that moment, what I was witnessing. I remember grabbing my sister Rachel's arm and asking her, in a whisper, what on earth the bishop thought he was doing, bidding on land none of us had the money to buy. She did not know either. None of us in the immediate family knew, not yet, what had been quietly arranged over the previous 6 weeks. The bidding continued to climb, and I watched as, one by one, the real estate agents and the men who had come representing development companies began to shake their heads, began to confer quietly with each other, began, eventually, to fall silent altogether, no longer raising their hands, no longer calling out new figures. Bishop Byler kept his hand raised, kept nodding to the auctioneer, kept meeting every challenge with a calm that I have rarely seen matched, before or since, and behind him I began to notice other men were nodding too. Men from our own church district, and from the districts beyond. A whole quiet army of support standing shoulder to shoulder with him, though only he was the one actually raising his hand and calling the bids. And then, quite suddenly, it was over. The auctioneer called out a final number, paused, looked around the yard for any further response, and when none came, he brought his gavel down with a crack that I felt in my own chest, and declared the farm sold, to the trust represented by Christian Byler. I stood there in stunned silence. I did not understand, not fully, what had just happened. I turned to my husband, and I remember my voice shaking as I asked him if he understood what we had just witnessed, and he shook his head slowly, looking just as bewildered as I felt. It was Bishop Byler himself who came to find me, perhaps 20 minutes later, once the paperwork with the auctioneer had been settled, once the crowd had begun to thin, and the disappointed real estate agents had climbed back into their cars and driven away empty-handed. He found me still standing near the old oak tree at the edge of the yard, the same oak tree my father used to sit beneath in the evenings, and he took both of my hands in his, the way an elder does when he has something important to say, and he told me the truth. He told me that the farm had just been purchased, for a sum I will not repeat here out of respect for the many families who gave sacrificially and privately, by a trust made up of nearly 70 families from our community and the surrounding districts, along with several English friends of my father's who had insisted on contributing when they heard what the community was attempting to do. He told me that every single one of those families had given not because they expected anything in return, but simply because Amos Stoltzfus had been, in ways large and small, a blessing to nearly every one of them across his 87 years. And they could not stand by and watch his life's work turned into house lots for people who would never once walk that ground with the reverence he had walked it with. And then he told me the part that broke me open entirely, the part I had not seen coming even after everything else. He told me that the trust intended to transfer the deed of that farm to me and my siblings, together as the rightful heirs, for the sum of exactly $1, so that the land could remain in the Stoltzfus family, farmed by Stoltzfus hands, for as long as God saw fit to allow it. Bishop Byler went on to explain a few more details that afternoon, standing there with my hand still held in his. He told me that the trust had actually agreed, weeks earlier, on the very maximum figure they were prepared to bid, a figure decided carefully by 3 trustees after speaking with the bank and with a neutral land appraiser to understand what a truly aggressive developer might be willing to spend. That maximum, he told me, had been set high enough, deliberately and intentionally, that it would take an almost irrational buyer to keep bidding past it, and he said that he had prayed every single night for 6 weeks that it would not come to that no one would force the community's hand all the way to that ceiling. As it happened, the young man in the gray suit and the older gentleman with his rolled-up drawings had dropped out of the bidding a full $10,000 before the community reached its limit, which Bishop Byler said he took as a small mercy, a sign, he believed, that God had been present in that yard just as surely as he had been present at my father's graveside 2 months before. He told me, too, about the logistics of how such a large sum had been quietly gathered without a single word of it reaching my ears, or the ears of any of my brothers and sisters. Money had come in envelopes left at the trustees' homes, sometimes with a name attached, and sometimes without any name at all, families preferring, in the plain and humble way we are taught from childhood, not to be known for their giving. Some had given cash outright, savings set aside for their own children's future farms, willingly redirected for a season toward this one urgent need. Others had taken small loans against their own properties, trusting that the community would help them repay those loans in turn if hardship ever came calling at their own door, the way it always eventually does for every family. Sooner or later, the English hardware store owner, a man named Wilson Graybill, had written a check for an amount that made Bishop Byler's eyes widen even now in the retelling. And when the bishop had gently asked him if he was certain he could spare such a sum, Wilson had simply said that Amos Stoltzfus's credit had never once come due in 30 years of friendship, and he figured this was as good a time as any to finally settle the account. I do not have adequate words, even now, 4 years later, to describe what I felt standing beneath that oak tree, hearing those words. I had spent 2 months bracing myself for loss, for the final severing of my family from ground that had held us for over 100 years. And instead I was being told that loss was not going to come after all. That an entire community, most of whom I knew well but some of whom I barely knew at all, had quietly, without any fanfare or announcement, without so much as a whisper reaching my ears beforehand, decided that this particular loss was not one they were willing to let happen. I wept, right there beneath that oak tree, in front of the bishop and my husband and whoever else happened to still be standing in that yard, and I did not care who saw me weeping, because they were not tears of grief anymore. They were something else entirely, something I have struggled, even in the years since, to fully put into words. Gratitude does not feel like a large enough word for it. It felt, in that moment, like the whole weight of 2 months of sleepless nights and quiet despair lifted off my chest all at once, and in its place came something warm and enormous, a feeling of being held, truly held, by more hands than I could count. Now, I promised you at the beginning of this video that the title would make sense by the end, and I imagine some of you have already guessed the reason behind it. The community wouldn't let me bid. I did not understand, standing in that crowd that morning, why my own family had not simply been given the community's money outright and allowed to place the winning bid ourselves in plain sight. I understand it now, fully, and I hope by telling you the story of that morning, of watching those developers fall silent one by one as Bishop Byler kept his hand raised and steady. You understand it too. They did not let me bid, because they knew, better than I knew myself in my grief, that a united community speaking with one unwavering voice could accomplish something that a single grieving daughter, however determined, could not have accomplished alone. They protected me from a fight I could not have won by myself, by fighting it for me. Together, without ever once asking me to carry the burden of it. The deed transferred within a few weeks, once all the legal matters were settled, and today, 4 years later, that farm still stands, still whole, still 340 acres of Lancaster County ground, though now it is farmed jointly by my brother Emmas's sons and my own son Aaron, who felt the calling to take up dairy farming the same way his great-grandfather once did. The barn my great-grandfather's mules helped clear ground for still stands. The fence lines my father mended 1,000 times still hold the cattle in. The walnut trees along the north pasture, the same trees my own cradle was carved from, still grow tall and strong. I go there often, still, an old woman now myself, and I walk those same fence lines in the evening the way my father used to walk them. And I think of him, and I think of my mother, and I think of the 87 years of one quiet man's life that touched so many people so deeply that when it came time for that life's work to be lost, an entire community rose up, without being asked, without expecting a single thing in return, and simply would not let it happen. Let me tell you what an ordinary Tuesday looks like on that farm today, 4 years on, because I think it matters that you understand the ending is not simply a nice story I tell, but a living, breathing place that still exists because of what happened that October morning. My son Aaron is out in that same barn before sunrise most days, same as his grandfather was, tending a herd that has grown back to nearly 50 head now. The barn itself repainted red just last summer by a work crew of his own cousins and neighbors, who showed up one Saturday morning with brushes and ladders and would not accept a single dollar for their labor, saying only that they were glad to see the barn looking sharp again. My grandchildren run through the same fields I ran through as a girl, and I have watched, more than once, one of my young granddaughters stop at the very same fence post where my brother Daniel once drove his buggy horse into the rail, though of course she has no idea of that history, and I have not yet found the right moment to tell her, though I suspect I will, someday, on some quiet evening much like this one. Bishop Byler passed away himself 2 winters ago now, from a stroke that took him quickly and mercifully in his sleep, and at his funeral, which was attended by even more people than my own father's had been. I stood in the receiving line and thought about that October morning, about his steady hand raised again and again against those developers, about a man who had quietly organized nearly $100,000 of community generosity without ever once seeking a word of thanks or recognition for it, content simply to have done what he believed was right in the sight of God. I think of him often now, too, alongside my father, 2 good men who understood, each in his own way, that the truest measure of a life is not what a man keeps for himself, but what he is willing to give away for the sake of someone else's tomorrow. I have come to believe, in the years since that October morning, that this is what community truly means, in the deepest sense of that word. It does not mean people who live near you. It does not mean people who share your last name or your church pew. It means people who will quietly, without fanfare, without even telling you what they are doing, until it is already done, carry a burden for you that you could never have carried alone. It means 70 families giving up money they had worked hard for, money some of them could genuinely not spare, because they believed that the story of Emma Stoltzfus's farm was not finished yet, and it should not end on an auctioneer's block in the hands of a stranger who would never understand what that ground had cost and given. Across 3 generations. If there is a lesson in this story that I hope you carry with you, it is simply this. However alone you may feel in your own hardest hours, however impossible the numbers may seem to add up in your own life, you may be far less alone than you believe yourself to be. There may be people around you, quiet people, people you would never expect, already working on your behalf, already carrying part of your burden before you have even found the courage to ask them to. I think, too, of all the small, ordinary kindnesses that made that October morning possible. Kindnesses that had nothing at all to do with money and everything to do with the way a person chooses to live across an entire lifetime. My father never once, in 87 years, sought to be repaid for a kindness. He pulled that veterinarian's truck from the snowbank and drove home without a second thought about it. He forgave debts at the hardware store during lean years and never mentioned it again to another living soul. He stood in barn raising lines for neighbors he barely knew, simply because a barn had burned and hands were needed, and he never once kept a ledger in his mind of favors owed to him in return. I used to think, as a younger woman, that this was simply who my father was, a naturally generous man, and of course that is true. But I understand now that it was also something more than personality. It was a way of living he had chosen, deliberately, across decades, the way a farmer chooses, season after season, to plant good seed in good soil, trusting a harvest will come even though he cannot see it yet from where he stands with the seed bag in his hand. I think of my father often, especially in the evenings, especially when the light comes low and gold across those fields the way it did on the day we buried him. I think he would have been humbled beyond words by what his community did for his children. And I think, too, that he would not have been entirely surprised. Because he spent 87 years quietly building exactly the kind of goodwill that came back to save his family in its darkest hour. He used to tell us, when we were children, that what you plant in other people's lives has a way of growing back around to your own, sometimes in ways you will never live to see. I do not think he imagined, when he pulled that neighbor's truck out of a snowbank at 2 a.m. all those years ago, or when he forgave a hardware store bill during a lean year, or when he simply lived his whole long life with a quiet and steady kindness toward everyone he met, that all of it would come flooding back, decades later, to save the very ground beneath his own children's feet. Thank you for listening to my story today. It means more to me than you know. An old woman sitting here telling you about her father and her farm, and the community that would not let her stand alone in her grief. If this story touched you even a little, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to my channel so that I can share more stories with you in the days to come. And please, before you go, leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching this from. I love reading every single one, and I read every single one myself, right here at my kitchen table, same as always. God bless you all, and thank you for sitting with an old woman and her memories a little while longer.